Okay, now I promise you we are not going to talk about this. But what I'd like all of you to do is think about your age and now divide it in half. And the reason I'm saying this is that both halves of your life are important. And I bet you that, let me tell you what set this up. I heard a minister this last week, and he was doing something that I have done in my past that I have learned to change. And that was, he was talking about, Jesus Christ and just how wonderful he was, and how if we want to know what God is like, then we just have to look at Jesus Christ. And he talked about the fact that Jesus Christ only loved, only helped, only healed, only blessed, only supported the weak and the sick, and that kind of thing. And that was what God was like. And that all this talk about hellfire was just simply mythology, that God simply wasn't that kind of God, et cetera, et cetera. I actually wrote him an email after and challenged him. And so here's what came up for me, because I have said, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus, and he only heals and helps and stuff like that. And what became very clear to me is that there are two halves to Jesus Christ's life. And that if we look at the first half of Christ's life when he came on earth and say, that's what Christ is like, that's like looking at the first half of your life and saying, that's what you are like. And you might say, oh no, I was much more angry back then. I was much less godly. I didn't focus as much on prayer. If you look at the first half of my life, I wasn't a really nice person. You really have to look at my total life to really get a picture of me. Well, that's like Christ. If you really want to get a picture of Christ, you have to look at the total man, not just his first coming. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 11. So in Isaiah chapter 11, and I think it's like 5 or 6, but you know what? I want to turn that off. All right, behave yourself. I am going to, gosh. All right, hold on a second while I adjust my iPad. It's misbehaving for me. Actually, it's not misbehaving. I'm misbehaving it. There we go. All right, we're there. Let's just pick up the context. So chapter 11 of Isaiah, a shoot will come out of the stump of Jesse. Now this is Isaiah 11. So the Assyrians had not yet carried away Israel. They would carry away Israel during Isaiah's lifetime, but not this early on in the book of Isaiah. But the Assyrians had attacked and done a lot of damage up till now. And besides, the great kingdom of Judah and Israel that was built by David and Solomon was destroyed in the rebellion of Jeroboam. And really, so what looked like the kingdom of David was not a great kingdom anymore. It was just a stump. And so that's why it says a shoot will come up out of the stump of Jesse. And who was Jesse? Yes, thank you, Michelle. I read your lips. David's father. You have very clear enunciation. That's great, huh? Okay, the shoot will come out of the stump of Jesse. So Jesse is David's father, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The spirit of Yahweh will rest on him, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and power, a spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Yahweh. By the way, does the spirit of Yahweh rest on us? Yeah, it's actually born inside us. So if we want a one verse vignette of what the Spirit of God can work in us when we open ourselves to it, when we're not afraid to kind of let it go. It's going to be wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge. Help us fear the Lord. You know, God is wanting to give us all that stuff, and he will feed us that through the Spirit of God. Verse 3, his delight will be in the fear of Yahweh. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, nor will he decide by what he hears with his ears, meaning he's not going to be deceived with his eyes like Eve was, or get lied to with his ears. Verse 4, but with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with equity for the humble of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the spirit from his lips. What's he going to do to the wicked?
Kill him.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, kill him. And this is what I wrote to the minister. You know, it's like, excuse me, you know, it's not, Jesus did a little more than just heal and bless, because we got to remember Christ had two comings. And the first time he came as the lamb. And he came as the lamb to be sacrificed. But in the second half of his life, he's not coming as the lamb. It's Revelation 5:5, I believe. Revelation 5:5. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And the second time Christ comes, he's going to come as a lion. And this, you know, it's interesting because we need to tell people this, and we need to know it. Unfortunately, our sin nature gets the best of us so many times that we become afraid of the judgment. And I mean, and there's days where I think I'm afraid of the judgment. It's like, you know, I'm feeling like I'm going to be at the end of the line. It's just our sin nature. I like what Paul wrote. You know, the thing that I want to do, I just can't pull it off. And the thing that I hate, that's what I end up doing. And here comes Christ, and he's going to kill the wicked. And that's one of the reasons that the next life is going to be so great. Let's go to 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5. We went back and forth. You know, what is it, 5? Let's see. No, I think it's 1 John 4 that says there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Let's see.
4:18.
Yep, thank you. Yes. Now, 1 John 4:18 is actually more specific than we've translated in the REV, because it has a general aspect to it. But if you actually look at the Greek text, it's slightly different than it occurs in most translations, including the REV. So if we back this up and we start in verse 15, whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God remains in him and he in God. Now, this is really powerful. If you confess that Jesus is the Son of God, God remains in you. God remains in relationship with you. This is a very powerful verse, because a lot of times in my mind, I think as if the verse is saying that whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God and lives a really perfect life, God remains in him. And I can get down on myself about the mistakes I make, or you know, this kind of thing, or the things that I forget. And it's really, if you think about it for a second, okay, does the Bible say that Jesus grew in wisdom?
Yes.
Yeah, it does. And does it say that he learned obedience through the things that he suffered?
Yes.
You know, it does. And I think about this, okay, if Jesus was a builder, the Greek word teknon, it got translated carpenter in the Middle Ages, and it's been translated carpenter ever since. And it certainly, you know, refers to people who do carpentry. but it's a much more general word than that. Jesus was a builder, and Joseph, his father, was a builder. And of course, they only lived 3 miles from Sepphoris, which was the capital of the Galilee during Christ's early life. And it had huge building projects. And I'm sure he and Joseph would probably load up all their tools on a mule and go the 3 miles or so, walk the 3 miles or so every day to Sepphoris and get involved in the building projects. Well, you think Jesus ever dropped a rock on his foot? Do you think ever hit his thumb with a hammer? Okay. And he, his father would say, son, this is the way you hold the hammer. Whack. Ah, well, I told you, that's not the way you do it. So he had to learn obedience. Well, is it a sin to drop a rock on your foot? Is it a sin to hit your thumb with a hammer? Is it a sin to make a mistake? When I think of, sometimes you watch particularly some of the older movies about Jesus, and it's almost like his feet don't touch the ground. He just kind of floats around from place to place, too holy to be in contact with the earth or something. Jesus was a fully human person, and he made just like every kid. I mean, frankly, it's kind of interesting that at 12 years old, he's talking to the doctors in the temple. Should he have told his mom and dad? Absolutely. It says, you can imagine how, they knew who he was, and all of a sudden the Messiah is missing for 3 days. He's a 12-year-old kid. He's missing for 3 days. Mary confronts him. Your father and I have looked for you sorrowing. And Jesus was just so, he's just like a 12-year-old. He's so nonchalant. He's like, what? I had to be about my dad's first business. What's the deal? But after that, it says he went and was subject to them. So he learned his lesson. But there's a growth in there. Well, wait a minute. I thought Jesus didn't sin. Well, acting like a 12-year-old when you're a 12-year-old isn't sin. And that's important for us to know. There's a lot of things that we don't do perfectly that aren't sin. They're just life. And that's just as simple as it is. And I love this verse 15. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God remains in him, remains in relationship with him, and he and God. It doesn't say you confess Christ as Lord and then do everything right and don't make any mistakes or not even any purposeful sins. And then it goes on and it says in verse 16, and we have known and have believed the love that God has for us. And we do know how much God loved us. For one thing, he sent his son to die for us. That's pretty good love. But then he does all these other cool things for us through our life too. So we've believed the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever remains in love remains in God. We remain in that relationship, and God remains in him. Verse 17. This is how love is perfected with regard to us. In other words, we confess Christ, and we remain in love, and we remain in God, and in that way, the love is perfected in us. It grows in us. It's not that we don't make mistakes. It's that it becomes perfected as we walk through life in love. It becomes perfected with regard to us. Why? So that we will have confidence in the day of judgment. Because just as he is, so are we, although still in this world. Just as Christ is, Christ is a representative of God, and we are, and in God's eyes, remember Ephesians 2:6, we're already seated in heavens. In God's eyes, Romans chapter 8, we are already glorified. And so scripture says, just as he is, that's the way we are. But then it goes on and says, yeah, but we're still in the world. And that's just something we've got to deal with. And then the next verse says, verse 18, there is no fear in love. And the Greek text says, there is no fear in this love. And what it's talking about is this love that's been perfected on the day of judgment. We show up at the day of judgment, and there's no fear in this love, because perfect love casts out fear. Now, it's a general principle, and that's why we left it translated the way we did. It's a general principle, but specifically it's talking about the day of judgment, so that we will have confidence in the day of judgment. Because just as he is, so are we, although still in the world. There is no fear in this love. Fear of what? Fear that we're going to get hammered in the judgment. That's the context. What it's saying is, look, if you confess Christ and you're a loving person, you shouldn't be afraid of the judgment. My gracious, it's coming, but we don't need to be afraid of it. And the perfect love that we have casts out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. Why is that? Because if it's the day of judgment and you've been sinning and haven't been repentant and haven't tried to be loving and haven't tried to stay in fellowship with God by confessing his son, then you're probably worried on the day of judgment. And that's why it says fear has to do with punishment. Absolutely, because you're afraid, gosh, it's the day of judgment, and I haven't done what I'm supposed to do, so I'm going to get spanked here. And that's what it says. There's no fear in this love about staying in fellowship with God. Perfect love casts out fear. Fear has to do with punishment. And the one who fears has not been perfected in love. Absolutely. We haven't allowed love to work in our life and really understood that's what God's looking for. Remember the commandments, on love God, love your neighbor. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So that love is what God is looking for. And then it goes on to say in verse 19, we love because he first loved us. And so this is talking about the judgment. And, and you and I can show up at the judgment and have great confidence. We can have wonderful confidence because we confess Christ and because we let work in us. We let love work in us. But then we look around at the world around us, and you're going to see people that are not so blessed. You're going to see people that have not confessed Christ. You're going to see people that are not letting love really work in them. They're holding on to anger, and they're vindictive, and they're not living a really loving, kind, godly life. And those people, are not setting themselves up for the best success, and particularly people that aren't saved. And there's a huge number of people on the planet who aren't saved. And you and I, as becoming fishers of men, have to become experts in kind of presenting the right bait in the right way at the right time to see if what we can do to lure people out of their cover. Bass and some of the fish I fish for, they like to hide and cover, and you got to figure out, how are you going to draw them out of the cover to get them to take the bait. And people kind of hide, like they hide behind their keyboards, and they're so courageous and fierce as long as they're typing anonymously on their keyboard, but then they won't say that kind of thing face to face. And we really see both halves of Christ's life very clearly. That yes, he was the lamb. Yes, he was very kind. Yes, he came the first time and very sacrificial, and he died for the sins of mankind, and he really helped people with their sin and that type of stuff. But he did, even in his first coming, he did confront evil. But in his second coming as the Lion of Judah, he's going to really deal with disobedience. Look at Psalm 2. We saw in the prophecy in Isaiah 11, he will kill the wicked. Let's look at Psalm 2. And we can overlook this stuff, but we really don't want to. Psalm 2 is a really short psalm, only 12 verses, and it's really fun. So let's just read it. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot a vain thing? So this is God, and one of the one of the interesting things about this is, David's writing here probably 950 BC ish, and the nations are all mad at God, and the people's plotting, vain or empty plots, and it's been 2,900 years, and that's still happening. Human nature hasn't changed. Verse 2, the kings of the earth take a stand, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his anointed, saying, let's break their restraints apart and cast their cords from us, because arrogant people don't want to obey God. They want to do what they want to do. Interestingly enough, Genevieve and I were listening to a motivational speaker on YouTube this morning, and he's supposedly a really good motivational speaker, but he's got a terribly foul mouth, which according to Ephesians 5 is sin. The reason that those four-letter words exist, they don't really come from God unless they come in a forensic sense, but they're used in the culture because of the devil. And the devil injects those words, and the man was talking, and he even admitted, and he said, my producers need to say that I need to stop cussing in my teachings on YouTube, and that I'm losing people because of it. And he said, but I have to be me. I wouldn't be me if I didn't talk like this. And I'm like, you don't have a clue. In other words, you're defining yourself as me by your sin nature. Your sin nature is who you are. That's just so crazy. We've got two, now I doubt he's a Christian. So he's probably should define himself by his sin nature and realize he's going to face the judgment. But we have two natures that fight inside us. And a lot of times, and I'm bringing this up because there's a lot of times when our sin nature is kind of rebellious, kind of wants to do something, I don't care if God says this. We get that out of our sin nature. And it's natural. Little kids have it. That's why they call it the terrible twos, that kids figure out who they are. And by God, they're going to run the world, or else they're going to stomp their feet. Little kids, the little 2-year-olds have these big tantrums. And what are they doing? They're acting out their sin nature. And what you and I have to do is bring our sin nature under subjection to our godly nature, which we can do by an act of our will. So he says, these guys, let us break their restraints, cast their cords off. Verse 4, and I love this. It doesn't say he who sits in the heavens is afraid or, worried about this. I mean, God on the fourth day said, let there be stars, and, millions of galaxies appeared. So here's some person on earth throwing a tantrum. It's not like God is worried about it. God.
Hey, John, in verse 3, when it says, cast their cords from us, what does that mean?
They feel like the rules and regulations of God are like bondage. Like the guy this morning, if I couldn't cuss, that would be like, that's not me. It would be like bondage. And people, they feel that having to keep the ordinance of God is some kind of bondage, some kind of cord that ties them up.
So he unties the cords, the ropes, and he just throws them to the side.
Yeah, and I'm going to cuss if I want to, and and then you get into sex. I'm going to do sex if I want to. I'm going to hit whatever I want to do, and we're just going to take the cords of God, the rules and regulations of God, and we're going to throw them aside. Yeah, and God just is like, okay, up in heaven, the Lord mocks them. Then he will speak to them in his anger. Then he gets upset and terrify them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. And, this is a prophecy of the future as well, talking about Jesus Christ reigning from Zion in the millennial kingdom. I will proclaim the decree of Yahweh. He said to me, you are my son. Today I become your father. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations as your inheritance. And of course, there's a number of prophecies that talk about this, that when Christ comes back, he's going to rule from sea to sea. And here's another one. I will give the nations as your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. Same kind of thing in Daniel chapter 2. Verse 9, you will break them with a rod of iron. At least at least 4 prophecies that talk about Christ ruling with a rod of iron, and you will dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel, which, again, this is the last half of Christ's life. The first time he came as the Lamb, he didn't have a rod of iron. But the second time he comes as the Lion of Judah, he's going to have a rod of iron. And it isn't wise for us to present one half. I mean, it's not like in any given teaching you might present either half of Christ's life. But if you're talking to somebody about the totality of who Christ is and how he portrays God, we need to insert in there that Jesus Christ, as he sets up his kingdom and as God is interested in working with people on an eternal basis, that he's not going to put up with all this, arrogant junk. He's going to rule with a rod of iron. And that's one of the reasons that people are going to treat each other well, because the arrogant people are going to be killed off. Verse 10, so now be wise, O kings, accept correction, O judges of the earth, serve Yahweh with fear and rejoice with trembling. Verse 12, kiss the Son, lest he be angry, which the Oriental kiss was a kiss of submission. It's like, for example, in the Middle Ages when someone would kiss the ring of the Pope or the hand of the king, something like that. It's not a kiss of love, although it's nice if you love the one you're kissing, but it's a kiss of obedience and submission. And so basically we could translate this into vernacular English as something like obey the Son or submit to the Son, lest he be angry and you perish on the road. Okay, there you go. You have a choice here. You're not the king. You didn't create the heavens and the earth, and you didn't make yourself. So we can submit to Jesus Christ, or we can perish. And that's exactly what the lake of fire is, Gehenna. People are thrown into Gehenna and they burn up. For his wrath will soon be kindled. I love that. 900 BC, his wrath will soon be kindled. Yeah, well, it's been 2,900 years. but it will be kindled sooner now than when David wrote it. That's for sure. And then I love how it closes. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. If you submit to the Son and take refuge in him, then you're going to be blessed, and life is going to be absolutely wonderfully fantastic. And the Apostle Paul, let's go to Romans chapter 15. This is a great verse for all of us because it's the Apostle Paul setting an example, and he says, verse 18 of Romans 15, he says, for I will not dare to speak of anything except what Christ accomplished through me. So Paul's saying, look, you want to know what I want to talk about? I want to talk about what Jesus has done through me and in my life. In other words, I'm not going to brag about any accomplishments that I've done. I'm going to talk about what Christ has accomplished through me, resulting in obedience of the Gentiles by word and deed. Basically accomplished through me by word and deed, resulting in the obedience of the Gentiles. Verse 19, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of Holy Spirit, that from Jerusalem and all the way around to Illyricum, and Illyricum was on the far west side of Greece. So this is Romans. So remember, he had not reached Rome yet. When he's writing Romans, he's writing Romans from Corinth. And so he had not ever been to Italy yet. So he couldn't say, I've preached as far as Italy, but Illyricum is a city on the far west side of Greece. So he says, all the way around to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the good news of Christ. And I have used this verse in my life as kind of just one of those things that I mentally post as a post-it note in my life, that different people have different ministries and different jobs, but as a teacher of the accuracy of the scripture, I am not doing my job unless I fully proclaim the good news of Christ. And that includes both comings. I can't just talk about how wonderful Christ was, and then people who good good people are blessed by that, and some people are at a point in their life where they just need to hear that. That's what they need to hear right away. They may not be emotionally at a point where they can hear about Christ ruling with a rod of iron because they're already under such condemnation or fear or something like that. They're just not ready to hear it. But as people get emotionally healed and mentally healed, they know that they need to know that Christ is going to run a righteous earth. And if we go to Revelation chapter 20, in Revelation 20, it talks about the final war and Satan being defeated. He is conceited, but he'll be defeated too. In verse 11 of Revelation 20, and this is the final judgment. This is the resurrection of the unjust, or the resurrection of the unrighteous. It's the what we call a second resurrection. So verse 11, and I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was no place, and there was found no place for them. And the scripture never tells us who this is sitting on the throne. The King James, in some of the manuscripts, the Byzantine manuscripts, some scribe added the word God, but we now know that God is not in the original text in this context. My gut feeling from John chapter 5, when Christ said, all judgment has been committed to the Son, I think that this is, Christ sitting on the throne. And he's sitting on the throne, and the earth and heaven fled away. Verse 12, and I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of the things that were written in the books according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and the grave gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged each one according to their works. And death and the grave were thrown into the lake of fire, because after this there would be no more death. This is the second death, even the lake of fire. And the reason it's called the second death is because the people who are thrown there die. I'm sure you guys are aware that the teaching that people burn forever in hell is not biblical. It came out of the Greek mythology. The Greeks believed in an immortal soul, and that then, that belief in the immortal soul was adopted by both the Jews and, of course, believed by the Gentiles, because in 323 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. And when he did, all the great Jewish learning centers, a few of the great Jewish learning centers were in Egypt. And when Egypt got conquered by Alexander the Great, those Jews began speaking Greek, and they began taking on Greek beliefs, one of which was the immortality of the soul. That is why by the time of Christ, the Pharisees believed in an immortal soul. They got it from the Greeks. So there were Jews teaching in an immortal soul, and then of course the Greeks believed in an immortal soul. And then because of that, the early Christians, as they began to come to the faith, as the early Christian Greeks came to the faith, they believed in an immortal soul. St. Augustine, when Augustine, was the most powerful saint in the early 400s, he wrote his well-known book, City of God, Civitas Dei. He wrote that from 417, I believe, to 423 or 424, something around there. But Augustine had written a book called 16 Reasons for the Immortality of the Soul before he ever even became a Christian, because he was a Greek and a Neoplatonist. So the Greeks believed and the Jews believed in an immortal soul, and therefore, as that became inculcated in Roman Catholic tradition, they believed in an immortal soul, and if it's immortal, then it's got to live forever, so it's going to live for hell in hell forever, and that's where you got the theology that you burn in hell forever. But the Bible is very clear that when people are thrown into the lake of fire, this is the second death, even the lake of fire. Verse 15, and if anyone was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. And this then became, Christ's warning. And it's not something we talk to people about on a regular basis, but it is part of the second part of Christ's life when he is the Lion of Judah instead of the Lamb. And I just have, I've been amazed between listening to unbelievers on talk radio and YouTube and listening to Christian ministers that are making excuses for the Bible. Well, God wouldn't be that angry. God would never do anything like that. God's really nice. All he's doing is saying to people, what you do doesn't make any difference. And it does make a difference. For those of us who are born again, it makes a difference in our rewards that we're going to get. And if you're not saved, it can make a difference about whether or not you make a decision for Christ or not. And we need to be honest with people when the time is right. Again, we have to be very cautious with this. We don't want to turn into hellfire damnation ministers. That's not who we are. It is the goodness of God that leads men to repentance in Romans chapter 2. And we've got to be experts at presenting the goodness of God. But part of the goodness of God is if you do live forever, there aren't going to be any wicked people there to make life miserable. And so then we've got to ask, well, there's plenty of wicked people on earth today. Gosh, you couldn't see a good movie if there wasn't a Lex Luthor or, what are some of the superhero bad guys? And I mean, the bank, every blasted movie has some bad guy that makes the movie interesting, and the conflict between good and evil. And in the millennial kingdom, there's going to be no evil people. Where did they go? Well, Isaiah 11 says that Jesus is going to kill them. That's where they went. So we've got to be willing to present that to people and share that. And so anyway, that's what I wanted to share tonight. Jesus Christ was, he spoke quite a bit. You probably remember the thing where he'd say, that if you're not in the wedding banquet, you'll be cast into the darkness and there'll be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. So he did talk about the lake of fire and death, more than people are aware of. And unfortunately, in the King James Version, it gets translated hell, and that's a mistranslation. It shouldn't have ever been translated hell. The word is Gehenna in almost all cases, and sometimes Hades, but when it's used as Hades, it's usually the grave. So that's what I wanted to share tonight, and I appreciate your attention, and more than happy to open the floor up for discussion.